Good evening. Thank you all for being here to discuss and get a taste of this fascinating new work that we're premiering this summer at Santa Fe Opera, The 13th Child. So we'll start by going right to the sources. Poul Ruders and David and Becky Starobin, a composer and librettists respectively. And this opera is born of a very, very long friendship and long collaboration in many ways, although not until now operatic. Can you tell us a bit about your history together and how you came to
Over to you. Oh, sure.
Does it work? Can you hear me?
Poul and Becky and I, well, Becky and I have been married nearly 44 years, but we met Poul about 35 years ago at Tanglewood. He was having an orchestra
86,
piece.
right, yeah.
Yeah, 86. So he was having a piece done called Manhattan Abstraction. Now, I thought, a Danish composer writing a piece about my hometown, you know. Anyway, he wrote an incredible piece. It's a great description of the energy of New York City. Anyway, I went to grab him backstage after the performance and commissioned a guitar concerto from him. And he's been writing me pieces for about 35 years. Becky and I run a record label, Bridge Records, and we record Paul's stuff. So I produce a lot of his recordings. I've conducted a lot of his music, and he's about my best friend on the planet. So we're very close.
Thank you.
So how did that evolve into an operatic collaboration after all these many years?
You want to try that?
Well, it felt as if it were time for Paul to write another opera. He had written a number of them, and they were each one tremendously successful, but very different. One that's being done by the Boston Lyric Opera in the next month is The Handmaid's Tale, based on Margaret Atwood's novel. And so Paul and I talked about the idea of another opera and tossed around the idea of it being a fairy tale. And from there, Paul went searching for a fairy tale and came up with a doozy.
Yeah, I started plowing my way through their various stories collected by the Brothers Grimm, which is actually a fantastic name for those two brothers, because their stories, or the stories which they collected, are most of them mostly on the Grimm side. So I kept going back to one specific story, not particularly well known. It's called The 12 Brothers, and it's a fairy tale which also Hans Christian Andersen poached from, so to speak, and you may know the Andersen fairy tale called The White Swans, or The Wild Swans. White or wild, I don't really remember. Anyway, something with swans. And I presented the story to David and Becky, and you sort of understood what I was after, because it's a story with many layers. But the title as such, The 12 Brothers, is not exactly what would, haul you out to the edge of your chair, biting your fingernails with excitement. So because of the layout and the core of the story, which we will get back to, I thought that a title such as The 13th Child would be far more alluring. So I think you agreed right away.
Yeah, the process of the collaboration actually did not involve me initially. Becky took the Brothers Grimm story and started adapting it, and that took quite a while. It was over about a year period. Just the various plot elements didn't seem to line up perfectly with the stage work. So she added a villain, she subtracted a number of characters, and then when she started to write the libretto, the two of us sat down together to do it, and we proceeded from there.
But it more or less started with Becky writing the synopsis. I mean, the synopsis which I submitted, you completely turned it upside down and made it far more alluring and adventurous than my poor scribblings. Mm. So there we are. It started with actually with you making the whole plot far more stage-worthy, if that's the word. I think it is.
Yes, indeed, there is always a lot of work to be done in adapting a work of prose fiction into a drama. Would you like to elaborate on any specifics, any specific ways in which you dramatized it?
Well, I think that the plot itself shaped itself as we wrote a little bit. There was a general plot, but several elements, including the death of a character at the very end, those things presented themselves at the last minute. The story just never gelled until we made that move, and then there were a few other things. We added a comic scene that it just seemed to need a comic scene placed there, and so that was the last thing that was written in the libretto, actually. So.
Well, thank you. Well, we'd like to start the evening before we hear our first set of excerpts, getting an idea of the overall sweep, the overall plot, and our director, Darko Tresnjak, has graciously agreed to...
You have volunteered me for the task.
All right.
It's
true.
I'm teasing you, it's
Right.
mildly petrifying because trying to convey, to give you the synopsis of an opera without boring you, but to give you enough information. So I've tried to come up with a detailed haiku version. So in the beginning of the opera, the queen is pregnant with a 13th child, and she's longing for a girl. She's had 12 sons, needless to say. Her husband, the king, his mind is addled, paranoid. It's infected by his friend, by his cousin, Drokan. He's poisoning his mind. So the king thinks that his sons are plotting against him, that they want his life and his throne. But at this stage, they're between the ages of 4 and 14, I believe. So they're boys. The queen decides after the girl is born, first she sends the sons into exile to protect them from the father, and then eventually she sends her daughter away to protect her from danger. So many years pass, and the king dies, and the queen and her daughter, the princess, are reunited. And at the funeral, the queen is overwhelmed. She's at the end of her life, and she tells her daughter about the existence of 12 lost princes, her brothers. And after the queen dies, her daughter, the princess, goes on a quest to find the brothers. So for me, the essence of the story, it's a story, the heart of it, it's mother's sacrifice and daughter's quest to reunite the family. How's that?
That's fabulous.
Okay.
Is that
I was really stressing.
good? Relax now. So we're going to hear the first set of 2 excerpts right now, and Becky is going to set up these scenes for us.
In the first excerpt, which is in Act 1, Scene 1, the kingdom of Frogor is in crisis. Convinced by his cousin Drokan that his 12 sons plan to overthrow his throne, King Yarna is going mad. Queen Gertrude, pregnant with their 13th child, muses about the 12 princes and Froegor's magic lilies. And in the second excerpt, Gertrude tries to calm Yarna's anger and rage against the 12 princes. Yarna expresses his hope that the new child will be a girl.
Thank you, Becky. And we hear as Gertrude, mezzo-soprano Kate Farrar, and as King Yarna, bass Alex Rosen.
Dangerous foes, my blood pulses through your bodies, my will gives you life. child be born a girl. With your goodness, with your grace, O bright star, upon thy brow, pointing toward a higher place, is red as blood. The beauty of the flowers, they arch across the years. A sign our house endures.
Thank you. So, first thing I'd like to ask, Poul Ruders, talk to us about the use of falsetto in a role which is one of the lowest bass
dear,
roles
that-
I've ever I've ever seen on a page.
Well, sorry. The falsetto is specifically, what shall I say, clear when produced by a bass or a bass baritone, exactly like, I mean, the clearest string harmonics you'll get from the double basses. And the reason why I actually employ this falsetto technique is because it sounds very much like he's really on the edge. I mean, it's a little. No, it's not a little. It sounds. How shall I put it? It opens a window for the ear, if there is such a thing, into the madness of his mind. I mean, it's really. What's the word? It's compressed. It's contrived, and it really mirrors his encroaching madness. The
Thank
composer said. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you. What about, can you tell us something about the process of your collaboration? I know that David and Becky, though you've both written extensively before, this was your first operatic libretto, and also how the collaboration flowed back and forth between you and Paul.
Yeah, it was interesting because it was our first libretto, and one would expect that you would get a lot of notes from the composer, in this case, telling us to change things around, and it actually never happened that way. We wrote and we wrote and we wrote. We sent him a couple of early drafts, and his comments were basically, oh, that's very promising. I like it, I like it. So we kept going, and finally we produced a finished libretto. And with the exception of a few words that were changed for phrasing structure
and
things like
clarity.
that, and clarity,
Yeah.
the libretto that we presented to him made
Because,
it
I mean,
into the...
This is actually my fifth opera, and I mean, it's. I mean, it really is the best libretto I've worked with so far. I mean, this is not, I mean, because you are sitting here, but you immediately realized one of the most important things in a libretto, that short sentences, and because normally it takes forever singing a sentence as opposed to saying it. And the words are so delicately balanced between what prose and poetry. It sounds good in itself. It could actually also work as a sort of a radio play. It's yeah. So it was the quality of the libretto and the words. I mean, the mood, the color, and the precision and economy, which actually made the composition process easier than had I had to, I mean, weed away a lot of words. I really didn't need to, because it was more or less there.
Well, and in that sense, one of the things that we tried for was a kind of reductionism, so that rather than it being a talky, wordy libretto, if anything, we presented him with perhaps too few words, I don't know, but we wanted the words to score with images that were strong, and so the chosen words were, rather than being lengthy sentences, as he says, they were compressed. The other thing about that, I would say, is that one of the things that I've worked my whole life on is accompanying singers, and the idea of creating lines that actually phrase out naturally, melodically, is something that I find occasionally missing in opera librettos. It's more the province of song composers who generally set poems, and so, as Paul said, it ended up being a bit of a combination of prose and poetry. There's our use of rhyme structure, for instance, is not anything, it's not like rhymed couplets all the time, but the places where we do use rhyme, we tried to have them be, to make a point, a specific point. And so we saved them quite a bit.
And also, because we knew Paul's music for years and years and years, I think we both had it in our ear when we were writing the words.
We did. We actually imagined certain passages, what orchestrations he might dream up, and in general...
We weren't usually right.
No, we were right in a lot of places. But he surprised us in some places.
That's his job.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask Darko and Rita, in your travels, directing and designing a lot of classic works, as well as new works, but with classic works both in the opera canon and in the theatrical canon, you're dealing with a lot of dead authors who don't give you a lot of trouble, but they also don't give you a lot of information other than what's on the page. So what kind of an opportunity is it to think about creating a production of a brand new work that's never been seen before, and with the resource of the creators at your fingertips?
Shall I go first?
Well, I'll just say first that I haven't worked with that many dead authors. I tend to do new work.
Yes.
But yes, so you go first, Darko.
Well, I've directed about 100 productions since grad school, and I think I got to about 60 before I worked on a work of a living author.
Wow.
It was 30, I've directed 30 Shakespeare productions, and then I was kind of pushed into an assignment, and it didn't go well. And I didn't do it for 20 more productions. When I listened to this opera, when I looked at this work, it was so exquisite. 80 essential minutes. And having seen the work of Santa Fe Opera and seeing the quality and everything I knew about the company, I felt good because it's this precious. When somebody spends years working on something, you know, it's holding water in your hands. It's like, you want to protect every drop, and it's scarier in opera because in theater, we get a week of previews. On Broadway, we get a month. But even the final dress in opera, there are 2,000 people, you know, there. So it feels really, really precious. You know, when I encountered the work, it felt so exquisite. I had to say yes. Am I scared? Yes. It's my first world premiere opera.
Oh,
So,
wow. Because you have done opera before. I know you've done the Ghosts of Versailles in LA,
yeah.
and so you did have that.
I've directed many productions of operas, but that was a revival of the Ghosts of Versailles. But you know, I always say, you know, if something doesn't turn out perfect, Shakespeare is fine, Mozart is fine. You know, there will be other productions, but a new work is incredibly precious. So every decision you make along the way, and every intuition. But with this piece, and then the choice of designers, Rita Ryack is one of American masters. I saw her production of Casa Valentina on Broadway, very tricky assignment, and then I wanted to know everything about her. And I remembered seeing the movie Casino that she did, Martin Scorsese, and I looked at the range of her works, and I couldn't wait for the right project. And now I'll shut up.
And is this the first time that you've worked together?
First.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
I read, was it in your bio, the description by one critic of your work as haute couture meets lunacy?
Yes. Michael
Who
Feindel.
could resist that? Right? Yeah.
Yes. But I don't know even how to respond to that. It's very exciting to be doing a new production with such gorgeous music and libretto and with Darko, and trying to find the right visual interpretation. We're going to be, I don't want to reveal too much, it's quasi-medieval, a little pre-Raphaelite, but it's going to be very simple and graphic, I think. And the colors are being carefully chosen so that we've got shots of colors where they're needed. And, you know, I feel a lot of metaphor in the way we're designing it. I mean, if the set design, for instance,
By
am
Alexander
I allowed
Dodge.
to reveal this? Right, well, it's a castle, but Darko and Alexander chose to turn the castle on its side. So right away, so I think that the clothes against that kind of abstraction have to be a little bit more real. I believe that. Oh, there's scenic elements against this very kind of monochromatic background. Am I right? Is it monochromatic?
Well, I'd love to pick up that thread after our next set of excerpts, and we're just about ready for that. So Becky, would you set these next two excerpts up for us, please?
This is Act 1, Scene 1. Drokan's aria reveals the root of his hatred, unrequited love for Yarna's wife, Queen Gertrude. Drokan, regent for young Prince Frederick of Halvan, feels the trembling of the earth. On her deathbed, Gertrude speaks to her daughter Lyra about having sent Lyra's 12 brothers into the forest many years ago.
So we have now Brent Michael Smith singing the role of the villain Drokan, and that will be followed by Lyra, sung by Kasia Borowiec, and Gertrude, once again, Kate Farrar.
burning sun, neath the horizon, blazing in flame. When we were boys, there were but three, Frau Grönhoven and me. Now King Hoven is gone, and I returned for young Frederick. Hear the trembling of the
That night I sent them off, plainly dressed and in disguise, Corbin in the lead, we Benjamin at his side. With 12 lily bulbs, and I with a broken heart. Then I whispered, go to the forest, deep in shade. To grow and learn and seek the love which here has turned so dark with woe. Go, my princess, don't look back. If you can return to me, plant the bulbs of Frodon, lilies blooming red as blood shall banish evil
Paul, you have written a great deal of symphonic music and chamber music in addition to your 5 operas. Would you say you take a very different approach to writing opera? And if so, in what way?
In writing opera, I have to make absolutely sure that nobody is bored for 1 second, because it's also entertainment. It's showbiz, and when you have a good libretto, the form is more or less there. I mean, when I sit down to write, say, a string quartet or a symphony, I have this blank paper, or not, I mean, blank as such, but I have a completely untouched piece of sheet music with blank, what do you call them, staves, and everything is up to me. But when you have a libretto, in fact, any libretto is the form, And when the libretto is finished and everything not needed has been whittled away, then the form is there. And then it's up to the composer, in this case me, just to pour notes over the words and make sure that it talks at the heartstrings, because that's what opera is all about. It's emotion, emotion, emotion in the right location, which in this case is, of course, the Santa Fe Opera. No, opera is an emotional affair wrapped in showbiz.
Wrapped in showbiz. Indeed, so we can see some showbiz here. How, this is your 5th opera, as we've established, and how does the 13th Child line up with your 4 previous operas? Of course, the best known one is The Handmaid's Tale, which has made the rounds now all over the world, in the US and Europe. Seeing that you said you're very inspired by this particular libretto, how does this opera?
I mean, the 13th Child is, I mean, all 5 operas are completely different from each other, because it's important to me not to repeat myself, which of course lowers the bar. If I should ever write number 6. It's vastly different from any of its 4 predecessors. I mean, my first opera, a chamber opera called Tycho, it's about the discussion between the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe and the German astronomer and mathematician Johannes Kepler, whether it's the sun that revolves around the Earth or vice versa. And that goes on for 2 hours. Not exactly the most, I mean, I could just as well have set music to the phone directory. At any rate, then The Handmaid's Tale, that's a dystopian story. I don't have to, go into what that story is about. And then my 3rd opera was and is called Kafka's Trial, based on Kafka's seminal unfinished novel, world famous, The Trial. And that's, at least in my version, a black farce. Then I wrote an opera, a short opera, only 70 minutes, called Selma-Yetskova, which is based on Lars von Trier's film Dancer in the Dark. And that's a real tear-jerking tragedy. So, as we have touched upon before here this evening, what now? I was, of course, tempted to try my hand at writing a comic opera, but I'm too young for that. Remember that Verdi was 80 before he dared, even thinking about doing Falstaff, because that's so difficult, because it very easily becomes the composer who people laugh at and not the story. So I thought, a fairy tale, and a real adventure, a fantasy, where I can go completely overboard with all my obscene ideas. And here we are.
Well, now that you've told us that there's a scene of comic relief in this, we're going to hold you to that next comic opera.
There is, but well, it's about, how long is it, 4 or 5 minutes or so? If that, then it's, but imagine writing funny music for 2 hours, that's, oh no, I wouldn't do it.
What do they say, death is easy, comedy is hard? Is that how the saying goes?
Absolutely, comedy is the hardest.
So, Rita and Darko, we began speaking before a bit about the production, and just spinning off something that Paul was just saying about this being a fairy tale. Does that give you some kind of extra license for fantasy and imagination in your creating this production, more than something that would be sort of slavishly realistic?
Well, Brother Grimm, fairy tales.
It's not fluffy. It's not a fluffy.
But I somehow skipped fairy tales as a kid. In Yugoslavia, there were only 2 TV channels, terrible communist television, awful. But there was an Alfred Hitchcock festival when I was 7, and I saw Birds, Psycho, North by Northwest, Rear Window, and my religion, Vertigo. And Vertigo, I know many directors who say that teaches you about what a director does, that movie. And so that was my scary fairy tale as a kid. So the way that this opera is composed, 5 measures into it, it's like you're plunging down a tower. It's the Vertigo effect, or it's like you're falling down the well. So that became the inspiration for it. But I thought about it. There are fantasy elements, but it has it's not cute. It has a real wonderful edge in the music and in everything, and it's very appealing that way. So.
And how does that reflect itself, Rita, in your work on the production?
Well, at first I did look at fairy tales. I have a lot of old books that I used to pore through when I was a child. But they were very romantic fairy tales, like Cinderella. And this is very dark. And the things that happen to the heroine are so, it's very Brothers Grimm. It's grim. Darko and I have joked that the reason the king goes crazy is because his costume is so heavy. And the reason Gertrude sickens is because and she's had 13 children, 12, 13 by that point, and her costumes at the funeral are huge. It's just huge, so of course she's sick.
Well, you're helping the singers with your characterizations.
So, we're trying to make the costumes express the darkness, but also to inform the libretto and the characters, and work with the set so that we have a nice
If I can
painting.
mention, the thing that Rita showed me was an Edwin Austen Abbey painting at the Yale Library of Richard III wooing Lady Anne at King Henry's funeral. And I looked at the weight of the costume and the courtiers, and I thought these state funerals, because the way that the opera is written, it seems that Queen Gertrude dies soon after the funeral, and I looked at this painting and I was like, well, that would finish you off. So the painting, we're actually recreating it because it's a mesmerizing work of art.
It's just an amazing painting. I don't think it's very well known, but
it's
really,
a woman in a cage, basically, because the veils and the hats and everything.
Yeah, she's got
the
one of those
train.
huge train.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Well,
the whole
speaking of the death of Queen Gertrude, we're about
Poor
to hear
Gertrude.
from her ghost in this next set of 2 excerpts. Becky, will you do us the honors?
From Act 2, Scene 1. Lyra, fulfilling her promise to Gertrude, searches for her brothers. And Act 2, Scene 2. In Act 2, Scene 1, Lyra encountered her brothers, but through a dreadful error has turned them into ravens. In Scene 2, an apparition of Gertrude appears. Lyra asks the ghost of her mother how to bring her brothers back to their human form.
We have, again, Kasia Borowiec and Kate Farrar. through listening to these excerpts, I'm detecting some thematic work going on. Am I correct in that?
Thematic as in tunes?
Yes.
You got it.
All right. Would you like to tell us about that? Also, are they rooted in dramatically thematic things or verbally thematic things?
Oh, I really don't know. I mean,
Okay.
I just write it. I mean, it's in this case, it must be because, I mean, the words inspire me and immediately, trigger off, hopefully, the right notes. I mean, it's vastly different from my instrumental music. It has to be a perfect symbiosis between what's in the words and how it projects from the stage, helped along by the music. I mean, music is the ultimate emotional locomotive, so to speak. It's a strong emotional play is say, I mean, think of Wojciech by Georg Büchner, a harrowing story, but it gets even more harrowing when Mr. Alpenberg enters the scene and puts it into his famous opera, Wojciech. Music always puts an extra layer of emotional power and protection onto even the best of words. The very best play, so to speak, is, say, like Shakespeare or Ibsen. I would never, dare or even feel the necessity to write, say, a Shakespeare or an Ibsen opera because I don't feel it's needed. And so
They have their own music.
they have their own music, yeah.
Well, certain
Some composers would disagree with me,
Right.
but by and large, I would say that it's when music and text goes hand in hand as complete equals, that's where and when you get the most effective opera.
Darko, that leads me to wonder, in your work, again, with so much classic theater and opera, how does that differ? The way that you approach theater, spoken theater, and opera as a director?
Well, directing 30 Shakespeare plays is a good training ground for opera, I think. And just basically because I also direct straight plays, a lot of musicals, a lot of operas, and you have to have the respect for the essence of the art form and for what it takes to communicate it. You know, I have the greatest respect for people who do musicals 8 times a week. It's amplified. It's not the force that these ladies and gentlemen have, but they do it 8 times a week, you know, and how that's done. Technically, it fascinates me. With opera singers, I'm always amazed. It just seems superhuman to it, but you just have to have respect for each art form, and sometimes people get upset because everybody wants the answer that's like it's the same. It's very, very different. You know, technically, you know, figuring out with an opera how the set design can help focus the sound, what is an
Right.
acoustically friendly or an unfriendly set, how to create sophisticated blocking while they can clock the maestro, and all of that. So it fascinates me. You don't have to worry as much when you're doing a play about those things.
Right, there are those technical aspects that a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but they're very fundamental things in staging opera. But what about, for instance, in an opera, the composer gives you the beats that actors and directors have to find for themselves in a spoken play. How does that feel? Does
Well,
that feel limiting, or does that feel...
No, it's absolutely beautiful. And, you know, if you're lucky enough to work with actors in straight plays with a certain amount of expertise, well, they know the Shakespeare music. They know, they have the technique to do it, you know, the way that singers have a technique to do opera. So most of the time, you know, casting in a play, I don't cast operas usually, though I was invited to do one of the auditions for this, and it was great to be reminded what it's like to be in an opera audition, because it's been a while, but you know, I do like it when the actors are pre-screened and when I get quality.
That's great. So, I mean, for instance, when approaching creating a production, how much do the words and how much does the music influence your thinking about a production that you're creating of an opera?
Well, it's so fascinating because when I got this score, I had the words and I had a recording, but not all the tracks were put down. So a lot of it was imagination. But I have to say, you know, because as a theater director and an artistic director, I get so many scripts. At times I get, you know, the worst was I got 6 productions offered in 90 seconds. You know, you get a lot of things, and and it's tough saying no, which is mostly what you do.
It's a good
and
problem
stuff.
to have.
But with this, you know, off the page, I was like, oh my God, it's 80 essential minutes in 7 scenes. It moves quickly. It just felt, and what you were saying, Paul, about music is, it fills in those other emotions that are, so I just thought it was magnificent, and I was so happy. I could sense it, even though I couldn't hear all of the voices. This is the first time I'm hearing some of the passages live, so.
Same here, by the way.
Well, speaking of the recording, actually, you know, there has been a recording made of this by David and Becky Starobin's company, Bridge Records, which is scheduled to be released, am I correct, around the time that Santa Fe is doing this world premiere production?
Even earlier, June 6th is the launch date for the recording.
So if you want to get an audio preview, you can. Actually, one of our singers, Alex Rosen, is involved in that recording, but otherwise it's a different cast than that we will have at Santa Fe.
Except for Tamara Mumford.
Oh, right, yes.
Who we share with the Santa Fe production.
Right.
The Queen Gertrude.
Queen Gertrude, so, yeah, wonderful, wonderful singer. So this brings up the collaboration that Robert Maya, our general director, mentioned at the beginning with the Ernze Symphony. Can you tell us a bit about that, how that came about? Also, it's interesting to me because Ernze is also the city of Hans Christian Andersen, isn't it? So it's something of an irony that you've chosen the Grimm version of this tale.
It is, yeah. We record this orchestra it's the 3rd largest city in Denmark, which means perhaps there are 200,000 people there. The biggest city having, what, 500,000? Copenhagen, maybe?
Oh, come on, 1 million now.
Is it 1 million? Okay. 5 million people in the whole country, though, of Denmark. So,
going on 6 million.
Anyway, we regularly record this orchestra, and their CEO, Finn Schumacher, was interested in the project, and so we said, do you want to record this? And he said, yeah, but we can't get the singers. So we recorded the orchestral music in Denmark, and then came back to New York, edited it, and then made click tracks so that all of the singers could follow this, and we recorded the singers on top of the orchestra, and then we mixed all of it. It's been 2.5 years in the making to do the recording, so I will be very pleased in a couple of months. And I also, I got involved in it in a way that I did not expect when our conductor of the orchestra showed up at the Copenhagen airport and called us the morning of the recording session of the 2nd act to say, my wife's about to give birth. I have to turn around and fly to Israel.
Oh my
I'm
gosh.
sorry. And so I knew.
This was at about 8:30 in the morning
Yeah.
for a 10 o'clock recording session. And he had also called the orchestra manager, who was in an utter state of panic.
So what did you do?
Well, the thing David didn't
Enter
mention
David
was-
Starobin, who's also a more than accomplished conductor. I can assure you.
Anyway, I ended
What
up
luck!
conducting it, and it worked out all right. It's an orchestra that I've produced recordings for, you know, just up there in the booth working with other conductors. And so they know me very well, and I don't think they hate me, so I was able to get up there, and they played beautifully for me, and it turned out okay.
The rest is history. Becky, can you set up this last set of 2 excerpts for us?
Excerpt 7 from Act 2, Scene 3. Prince Frederick recounts finding Lyra in the forest. Excerpt 8 from Act 2, Scene 4. The youngest of the 12 brothers, Benjamin, has been mortally wounded by Dracon. Lyra grieves as Benjamin dies. Lyra, Frederick, and the 11 brothers sing a final message of hope at the end of the opera, despite their grief.
And we will hear as Frederick, tenor Alec Carlson, and as Dracon, once again, Brent Michael Smith, and then Lyra, Kasha again, and as Benjamin, Bernard Holcomb, and Frederick once again.
I returned to Frogger, but Lyra had vanished. For 7 years I searched in vain. Red streaks on mounts the morn. Ravens flew above, guiding us deeper